Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be walking through the Landscape Sculpt tool in Unreal Engine 5. The Sculpt tool is a way for you to, well, sculpt your landscape. Using this tool, you'll be laying out the general geography of the land, the contours, whether there's mountains, hills, valleys, rough terrain, smooth terrain, that sort of thing. So in this video, you'll get to know the tools which will allow you to create the foundations of the world that later on in the course you'll bring to life. So, without further ado, let's hop over into Unreal and get started. Alright, here we are in Unreal. First of all, before we do anything else, you may or may not have your content browser window exactly where mine is right now. If you don't, what you'll need to do is go to the content drawer in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, which is actually off my camera. There we are. The content drawer is right at the bottom of the screen, bottom left-hand side, or press Control Space, which will open up this content drawer thing, and then at the top right of that window, there's an option to dock in layout. So I like to have my content browser open and available all the time in Unreal. In the new version, they've added this nifty thing where you press Control Space and it gives you this like pop-up drawer. I hate that. I'm much more of a traditionalist, so I like to keep the content browser open at all times, ready for use. The other thing that I'm going to do is, because my face is covering half of this window over here, I'm going to add a random window under Window, Levels, and dock that into the side of my content browser, and just move that over there. This is not something for you to do. This is just so that my face isn't in the way of anything on your screen over here. All right, now that's out of the way, you should have your content browser open and accessible. And if, like me, you started with the starter content, then you should see this really nice and beautiful and calm, peaceful default scene with two chairs and a table, which is useless to me. I don't want this. I want to start, like I've said before, I want to start from a completely blank slate. So I'm going to ignore this scene and create my own. The way that we do that is under your content browser, I'm going to create a new folder called Maps. I just like to have everything in my project as partitioned as possible, and then right-click under Maps and go to Add Import Content, and then Level. So level is the same word for map. It's creating a new kind of scene for your world. A new map, a new level, scene. I'll use all those words interchangeably. I'm going to call this Landscape Sculpt Map or something. If you're creating an intentional world, like you're going to create a tundra environment or a hilly environment, then name your scene that. But in this case, I'm just demonstrating the Landscape Sculpt tool, so I will call it Landscape Sculpt Map. Ooh, there's a tongue twister. All right, so if you double click on that, then your browser will open a seemingly black canvas. So this has nothing in it now. And if you look in the outliner, that is verified in that there is nothing in the scene. So the first thing that we need to do is, even though we're going to talk about lights way later, we might want to add some lights just so that we can see what we're doing. So adding lights is quite easy in this new version of Unreal. If you go to Window, Environment Light Mixer, this is the tool that we'll be creating and modifying our lights with down the line. For now, though, all we need to do is add a couple of these light options that we have here. So I'm going to create a skylight, an atmospheric light 0, and don't worry about what all this means at the moment, and then a sky atmosphere. And for now, that's all I'm going to add. So add those three which I just did, the skylight, the sky atmosphere, and the atmospheric light 0. And now you'll see that in your world, you at least have this sort of not bad looking sky gradient, and then a black floor around you. So this is a good canvas for us to start, and we can close that down because we don't need it anymore. We just need it to be able to see the landscape that we're creating. The next thing that I'm going to do, just because I like to keep my project as organized as possible, is in my outliner, create a new folder and call this Lighting, and just add those 3 objects which we've just created using the Environment Light Mixer into that lighting folder. So I just selected them and dragged them in, and that way I can collapse that lighting and not really worry about it until later on when I need to. All right, so now that we have some lights in our scene and we can see what we're doing, we are able to start creating our landscape. So to do that, we're going to have to switch modes. We haven't really used the modes a lot, but if you've used Unreal previously, or you went through one of the starter videos, then you might be familiar with the fact that you can drag things in from the place actors scene. So for example, this cube, which I'll just drag in, and then maybe a sphere, and then you can select these things, move them around in your world, and that's kind of how, oh, that's cool, being reflected quite nicely. That's how you add things to your world, move them around, using this mode of the engine called select mode. And you can see what mode we're in the top left-hand corner of the screen. Let me just delete this cube, the sphere, and I'm going to take the cube and center it into the middle of the world, just so that I can have some sort of reference point where the center of the world is, and scale as well, size. So the default cube is 1 meter by 1 meter. So if you set the cube scale to 111, you know that this cube in the world is going to be 1 meter by 1 meter. And that can help me kind of ground myself in this otherwise abstract void. All right, so now that we have a reference cube, let's hop over into a separate mode called the landscape. That landscape mode is in the top right-hand, I really need to get my directions right, the top left-hand side of the screen. Under select mode, you see all these different modes, and we'll cover some of them throughout this course. The default is select, and the landscape mode is the second one. So select mode allows us to select things, move them around. Landscape mode allows us to create and edit landscapes. If I move to the landscape mode, I can no longer select my cube, and I can no longer move it around. If I move this gizmo, it's actually moving something else. It's moving the landscape itself. So let me quickly undo that. Now that we're in landscape mode, if you look around, I don't know why it's clipping like this, but that probably shouldn't be happening. But if you look around, you'll notice that there's now a green grid on your screen. This green grid is going to be our landscape. This is kind of the mesh, the net that our landscape is then going to be created on. If you look around, there's like a set of large bright green squares, and then a set of much smaller, sort of darker, less green squares. And this is sort of in the background how this landscape is going to be created, and it helps with things like memory management. And when your camera looks at this area, only these squares that are visible will be active, so it helps kind of, that's called culling, and that helps a lot with the performance of your scene. You don't need to worry about that too much. What you need to worry about is how that affects the actual landscape you're creating. Each of the large squares is called sections, which you'll see referenced down in this creation menu options. And each of the small squares, in this case, are called quads. You might hear me refer to them as cells. That's just the way I think about them, but officially they're called quads. If you look at this creation menu, which we'll get to in just a second, you'll see that the section size is made up of 63 quads. So each of these larger squares is going to be 63 of the smaller squares by 63 of the smaller squares. And you could change that by saying 7 quads. So now we have a much smaller landscape made up of the same resolution. On the other hand, let's go back to 63. The world is also created using 8 by 8 of the sections. So in this case, it's called components, but I think sections and components is interchangeable. So if we were to say, let's say 16 sections, then we've extended our world to double the size that it was before along X. And if you do the same thing on Y, now you have a landscape that is 16 by 16. So the default is 8 by 8. And then the last thing to do with the size is the actual scale over here, which at the moment is 100 by 100 by 100. This scale refers to the size of each individual quad. So if we zoom further into the center here and try and get it so that the grid doesn't disappear, you'll see that this cube that we created earlier, which we know is 1 by 1 by 1, is about the same size, well, not about, exactly the same size as one of the individual quads. That's because the scale of those quads is 100, which in Unreal units means 1 meter, 100 centimeters. So each of these individual quads is a meter. If we were to increase that to 200, then my grid disappears, but I can go further back. Each grid is now double the size of that 1 meter cube, because each grid cell quad is 2 meters. And that means that our landscape is also double the size that it was before. So if I change this back to 100, then the landscape goes back to its original default size. So using these three settings, the scale, the section size, and the number of components, you can change the size of your landscape. I don't really suggest changing the scale unless you have a really good reason to, because that changes the resolution of your grid. And if you set the scale too high, so if we were to say 400, this landscape, these larger squares, are going to start looking really blocky when you sculpt it out. You want to try and deal with as high resolution as you can. But we set that back to the default, and then if you want a really detailed terrain where you have lots of like grungy noise on the ground, you might even want to set that a little bit lower. But there's other ways that we can add in that detail later on. So that's all to say, I strongly suggest that you leave the scale at 100, 100, unless you have a really good reason not to. So the other two ways then of changing the size of your landscape are to change the section size, so create larger sections, for example, doubling the size of your sections, or to change the number of components. So I think there is a max for the number of components that you can set. It seems to be 32, and there's also a max section size, which is 255. You could do the maths and say, okay, so we have 255 quads and 32 sections, so that equals about 8,000 individual cells, or you can just let Unreal do the maths for you, which it does. And this is important all to know. I'm not just saying it randomly, because this will determine the overall size of your world. The maximum world size that you can create using this landscape tool is 8,000 by 8,000. And because our scale of each individual quad is 1 meter, that means that our world is 8,000 meters or 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers. And that is really, really huge. So that's probably a lot more than I need. So if I go back to my default 63 sections, quads, and 8 sections by 8 sections, and we have a look at the overall resolution, that's 500, which is a little bit more manageable. I might want to increase it a little bit so I can have some distant room to play with, but this resolution basically means the size in meters, obviously if your scale is 1 meter, of your world. So if you know that you're going to have a pretty small world and you're not going to need a lot of space, you can set this resolution pretty low. 500 meters by 500 meters is still a decent chunk of space to play with. But what I usually do is go for 16 components and 127 quads. And that gives me a 2-kilometer landscape on either side to play with. That's just me, and that's just what works for me. So I suggest you start playing around with the landscape tool and exploring different configurations and what works for you. Just know that the scale, the section size, and the number of components all add together to create this overall resolution, which is the size in meters of your world. So that's probably the first thing you should figure out. What size is the world that you want to create? After you've done that, you can explore the rest of these options on the left and make sure that the world is set up as you intend it to be. So the next thing up from all this scale business is the rotation, which you can also change. It's locked in X and Y. So if I click on X or try to type something in, it always resets to 0. And that's because the landscape always needs to be flat against the ground. There's no way to change that. It's just the way that it is. What you could change, if you really wanted to, is this rotation around Z. But I don't think you should. Strongly don't recommend it. I like to keep it at 0 so that my landscape is aligned on these world axes of Y and X. And then the other transform that you can change on the landscape is the location. For some reason, the default is 1 meter above the ground. So that means that if your landscape is created using the default settings, the sort of default floor level will be 1 meter above the ground. I'm sure there's a reason for that, and I suspect that it has something to do with adding water later on, so that the water doesn't come in at ground level. But it is a little bit confusing for me, because if I drag anything into the scene, it will be below the ground. So what I like to do is set that to 0, and now I know that my landscape is coming in at the 0, 0, 0 position in the world, and that makes the most sense to me. Next up, above the location, is the layers. Don't worry about that for now. We'll talk about layers later on. and then above that is the material. We'll also talk about the material in the next video, so we're going to leave that blank. The final setting here, the top one on this list, is Enable Edit Layers. This is an option that you don't need to enable, but it does allow you to use some of the more advanced landscape features, which I will talk about in a future video. So if you are interested in using some of the advanced features like procedural landscape generation, then this is probably a good setting to just make sure you've checked at the beginning, don't have to worry about it until later, and then it's already set up for you. All right, so now we've set up the landscape in the way that we want it. I've verified that my resolution is the size that I hope it to be, so I've got a 2K landscape to deal with. And I'm going to hit Create. Amazing. Now the landscape is generated, and I've got this checkerboard pattern extending out into the distance. That's because I don't have a material applied yet. Don't panic about that. We will add that in the next video. For now, though, this checkerboard pattern is a good way for me to get a sense of what the shape of my landscape will be. I've also been moved from the Manage tab, which is where we created our landscape, into the Sculpt tab. The Sculpt tab is where the magic of this video is going to be happening. Our first tool is the Sculpt tool, and if you just, with the default settings, click on the landscape, you'll see what happens. It starts to raise up the landscape in the area that I'm clicking. So at this point, you can just begin to have at it. You can just start sculpting your mountains in the background, and that's pretty much all you need to know. So that concept is kind of the foundation of this sculpting tool. You'll pick an area of the landscape and you'll shape it into a specific shape that you want it to be. The other thing that you can do with the Sculpt tool is hold Shift and then click, and it will lower the terrain in that area. So using this tool alone, you can start creating mountains and valleys and lakes and rivers and all sorts of stuff in your scene. That's just the default setting. And there are plenty of other settings for this Sculpt tool that you can start to explore and play around with.